Bhadravarman I, the warrior king who consecrated the sacred valley of my son. Introduction. A call from the sacred valley. In the dense jungles of Quảng Nam province, there lies a valley encircled by majestic mountains, like the protective arms of a deity. Within this valley, ancient red brick towers rise toward the sky, silent and mysterious. This is the Mỹ Sơn sanctuary. For nearly a millennium, it was the religious heart of a mighty maritime kingdom that has since vanished. But a question always echoes through the moss-covered stones. Who was the first to see the divinity in this land? Who laid the first brick, giving birth to one of the greatest and most enduring religious centers in Southeast Asia? The answer takes us back in time to the 4th century, to a warrior king, an erudite scholar, and a ruler whose vision shaped the faith of the Champa kingdom for nearly 1,000 years. He was Bhadravarman I. This is not just the story of building a temple. It is the story of the birth of a center of spiritual power, where the king and the divine became one. Chapter 1. Historical context and the dynamic world of the Lignyi kingdom. In the 4th century CE, the world in which Bhadravarman reigned was one of great flux and opportunity. In the north, the mighty Han dynasty had collapsed, and its successor, the Jin dynasty, was facing its own internal turmoil, creating a power vacuum on its southern frontier. This allowed the kingdom of Lignyi, the precursor to Champa, the space to breathe, to consolidate, and to rise without overwhelming pressure from the north. Simultaneously, the maritime Silk Road was at its peak. The South China Sea was not a barrier but a bridge connecting civilizations. Merchant ships from India, Persia, and even the Roman Empire brought not only goods but also powerful ideologies, religions, and models of statecraft. The kings of coastal kingdoms like Lignyi realized that to rise above the stature of a tribal chieftain, to rule over a diverse kingdom with many clans, they needed a grand ideology. A religion capable of unifying the people and deifying the monarchy. They looked toward India, a land of highly developed philosophical and religious systems. The Champa kings actively invited Brahmin scholars to their courts. These were experts in ritual, in law, and in the Sanskrit language, the international language of the elite and of religion at the time. Bhadravarman I inherited a rising kingdom at a historical crossroads. He did not simply continue the path of his forefathers. He decided to elevate his kingdom to a new level with both the sword and with sacred knowledge. Chapter 2. Portrait of the founding king through his inscriptions. What we know of Bhadravarman I comes primarily from the most authentic evidence, the stone steles that he himself had carved. These inscriptions, written entirely in classical Sanskrit, paint a striking dual portrait of an extraordinary ruler, a decisive warrior king. Bhadravarman was not a king who merely sat in his palace studying scriptures. He was a talented and ambitious military leader. Chinese historical records note that he led attacks northward into the Jin-controlled district of Cu Chun, corresponding to the modern Thanh Hoa region of Vietnam. While these attacks may not have been for permanent conquest, they reveal a confident king who did not hesitate to use military force to expand his influence, seize wealth, and challenge larger powers. He firmly consolidated his kingdom's independence. A pious and erudite scholar, the second facet of Bhadravarman I is even more impressive. He was the first Champa king whose surviving inscriptions were all carved entirely in classical Sanskrit, the scholarly language of India. This marks a massive cultural shift. It proves that his court had absorbed Indian high culture at the deepest level, not merely borrowing but mastering it. In his own steles, the king proudly describes himself as a master of all 4 Vedas, the most ancient, complex, and profound scriptures of Hinduism. The Vedas are the foundation of Brahminical philosophy and ritual. For a king to declare his mastery of the Vedas meant he was not a passive recipient of religion. He was a scholar, a philosopher who had grasped the foundations of the faith. This gave him supreme spiritual authority, placing him on par with the most learned Brahmin priests. The combination of a valiant warrior on the battlefield and an erudite scholar in the court created a man with sufficient vision and power to undertake a great work, a project that would define the faith of a nation for 1,000 years. Chapter 3. the consecration of my son and the covenant with the god Shiva. The greatest and most immortal achievement of King Bhadravarman I was his selection and consecration of the Mỹ Sơn Valley, transforming it into the religious center of his kingdom. Why Mỹ Sơn? The location was not random, but a choice based on principles of sacred geography. Situated in a secluded valley surrounded by high mountains like a natural wall, Mỹ Sơn had a perfect defensive position and a space separated from the secular world. More importantly, it had a sacred topography. A stream, known today as the stream, flows from the mountains through the center of the valley. Water is a purifying and holy element in the Hindu faith. This valley was a perfect space, a place where mountain and water, heaven and earth could meet, an ideal abode for the gods. It was a natural mandala. Here, around the end of the 4th century, Bhadravarman I commissioned the first temple. According to inscriptions, the original temple was made of wood. And at the center of that temple, the king performed a foundational act, a ritual that would influence the entire subsequent history of Champa. He established a linga for the worship of the god Shiva and gave it a very special name, Bhadresvara. This name is a stroke of genius, a combination of the king's own name, Bhadravarman, and one of Shiva's titles, Isvara, which means the Lord or the Supreme Being. Bhadra plus Isvara equals Bhadresvara. This act carried a profound meaning. It was not just the worship of a god. It was a unification, an identification of the king with the supreme deity. The god Bhadresvara was not just the universal god Shiva. He was also the spirit of King Bhadravarman, the divine protector of his dynasty and of the entire Champa kingdom. This was the beginning of the god-king cult, or Devaraja, in Champa. The Bhadresvara linga became the national treasure, the most sacred palladium, the focal point of the nation's spiritual power. Conclusion. The man who laid the first stone. Although the original wooden temple of Bhadravarman I was consumed by a fire 2 centuries later and rebuilt in brick by his successors, the legacy he left is immortal. He did not just build a temple, he gave birth to the Mỹ Sơn sanctuary. He was the first to recognize and designate the sacredness of this valley, turning it into Champa's most important religious center for nearly the next 1,000 years. He founded the national cult. By creating the god Bhadresvara, he brilliantly fused royal power with divine power, creating a solid ideological foundation for the Champa state. He shaped Champa's cultural identity. By making Sanskrit the official language for royal and religious texts, he integrated Champa deeply into the wider cultural world of Greater India, affirming his kingdom's sophistication and prestige. Many later kings built grander and more complex brick towers at Mỹ Sơn, but King Bhadravarman I will forever be remembered as the one with the founding vision. He was the one who laid the first foundation stone, not just in a literal sense, but in a spiritual one. He laid the foundation for a religious center, a royal cult, and a cultural identity that would survive and shine brightly throughout the long history of the Champa kingdom.